All right, Musketeer Report Podcast, August 23rd. We've got more Big East team previews coming your way. Creighton is up today. We're going to talk to a guest about the Blue Jays. But in terms of Xavier coverage, real quick, school started this week, which means the current team is back on campus and workouts are back underway. I'll continue to post any nuggets I hear from those workouts on the premium message board at musketeerreport.com. There will be a few things to talk about from those. Most of it you've probably already heard most of throughout the course of the summer, but things will really ramp up here in a month or a little bit over a month when they get into official practice. That's kind of what you're looking for as a fan, for the intensity and the coverage to really ramp up here soon. So we're not far away now that they're back in school. From a recruiting perspective, Nick Lewis, we've talked about a lot on this show, the point guard from the DMV area. He is still basically the top target for the Musketeers, at least from my perspective. Now, his recruitment has shifted a little bit over the course of the last week plus. I talked about that over the weekend on the musketeerreport.com message board. If you want to check that out, I won't rehash it here, but you can go in and find that information. And really, it's all good news from a Xavier perspective. The Musketeers are still definitely in there and still pursuing him hard, though the other leaders, it's a little bit difficult to figure out who is the top competition for him and who else might really be in there. The only thing we know for sure is that Xavier is in a pretty good spot with Nick Lewis. So more on that at musketeerreport.com. And then there's another prospect that there was some news about this week, Jaden Forsyth, one of the top shooters in the country, 6'5" guard out of the Philly area. He has visits scheduled for Xavier and Butler in the middle of September. He'll go to Xavier on September 13th and then Butler on the 20th. And we're expecting a decision pretty soon after that. He has said that he wants to have a decision before the early signing period, which is in November. But it's possible it could be pretty soon, right after those visits are made. He hasn't scheduled any other visits to this point, and I'm not hearing of any others that might be scheduled. That can always change, but we'll keep you updated on what's next in Jaden Forsyth's recruitment as his visit approaches. All right, I mentioned Creighton Blue Jays preview is up today, so we will be joined by a guest from the Omaha World-Herald. Now, if you notice during the interview, a few different times I mentioned Omaha World Leader, despite it being right on the screen in front of me as I'm talking to him and me reading the paper all the time. I don't know why I said leader, but I did. So just deal with it and enjoy the conversation with Jon Walker from the Omaha World-Herald. All right, joining me now to talk about the Creighton Blue Jays is Jon Walker from the Omaha World Leader. Jon, really appreciate you joining me here. We'll jump right into it. Creighton last year was 25-10 overall. They went 14-6 within the Big East, which was good enough for second in the conference. That was also good enough to earn a 3 seed in the NCAA tournament, and they ended up losing to Tennessee in the Sweet 16. So here, I'll start with, I just wrote up my team preview for Creighton about a week ago, and I started off my outlook for this coming season with this sentence, and I want to get your take on it. I wrote, it's possible that Creighton is a slightly worse team than last year, but has a better chance to win the Big East. What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's so odd because, they're up in stores saying that this is maybe Dan Hurley's best team that he's had. And they're off of 2 straight, it's so nuts to think about.
Do you believe that under any circumstances, though?
Last year's team was pretty darn good.
That's what I'm saying. It's hard to believe that they're better than last year's team.
Yeah, I mean, they just rolled people. It was nuts. So no, I think maybe the gap between UConn and the rest of the league is a little shorter than it was. I obviously still think UConn's the team to beat, back-to-back national champs. But no, I think that's fair. They lost. Creighton loses. Baylor Shireman, Trey Alexander. When it's all said and done, 2 of the better players in program history. 25 years from now, people are going to mention Creighton, and people in Omaha will still have vivid memories of Trey Alexander and Baylor Shireman. The good part is they kept one piece of the big 3, and that's Ryan Kalkbrenner. I think the interesting thing is, I think maybe personnel, there are a lot more questions about this team. So I think maybe it's a worse team, but I think they're deeper than they were last year. That was one of the big problems when it came to Creighton was, where's the quality depth? Maybe that meant a redshirt freshman wasn't quite ready to play 10 minutes in the NCAA tournament. But it seems like going into this year, those redshirt freshmen from last year, they have another year of experience under their belt. They bring in 3 really talented freshmen, and they got a couple of immediate impact transfers. So there are probably no Baylor Shiremans or Trey Alexanders on this team, but I do think that Creighton's deeper than they were last year.
Yeah, I mean, let me get this out of the way. First of all, I mean, there's a big part of me that wants to pick Creighton to win the conference this year, that thinks UConn is only going to get that top spot going into the season because of Dan Hurley and what they've done the last 2 seasons. Like, when I look at the rosters, I really like Creighton's roster. That being said, I knew about Trey Alexander and Baylor Shireman from last year. I know what their stats said. I knew how good they were. And then when I started diving back into some of the film and going back through some of the games last year, it's like, man, you're losing a lot when you lose those 2 guys. I mean, Trey guarding the other team's best player at times and shutting them down in key moments. Him coming up with big shots at the end of games when they don't really have another guy to go get his own bucket, that you can't just say, let's run our system and get a spot up 3. Yep. You need someone to go create. He was the guy to do that. Baylor with his rebounding at critical moments. I mean, they brought so much in so many big moments in big games that it's like they are losing a ton with those 2 guys. But they've also added some interesting pieces in the transfer portal. Yeah. The interesting part about it is you lose 2 bona fide starters that are really good players, and you replace them with 2 guys that maybe aren't the same, maybe aren't as talented, but are clearly plug and play high major starters that do some similar things. Let's start with Pop Isaacs, who's coming over from Texas Tech. I mean, both of these guys, when I saw them, I go, wow, that's an interesting fit. That doesn't seem like a Creighton guy to me, because they're both kind of low efficiency, high volume, reckless, a little bit chaotic type players. I don't think of them as Greg McDermott guys, but I look at what they can do and their skill sets, and I think, oh man, if he gets more efficiency out of these types of players, what could they look like in Creighton's system?
Yeah, and that's the hope. I talked to Jemiah's NIL representative shortly after he committed. Haven't gotten the chance to talk to Pop yet, but I've talked to people in the program about Pop. And that was the big thing, is they had these players who were maybe inefficient at Texas Tech and Arizona State. And they believe that in Greg McDermott's offense, they can get them better looks, more open looks. And history would say that's probably going to be the case. So that's really what they're hoping, is that the biggest woe on these 2 players, kind of resume, is the inefficiency. And they're hoping that the offense, the scheme in Omaha, helps with that. Again, history would tell you that it should. They'll at least have more open looks, which is the goal. And yeah, when it comes to Pop, they needed a big-time bucket getter. I think that's fair to say that's what Trey Alexander was. Last season, when let's go back last summer, when he pulled out of the NBA draft, him and Greg McDermott sat down and had a conversation that when the game's on the line, you're going to have the ball in your hands. That's the faith, the trust that they put into Trey last year. And yeah, I mean, he had the ball in his hands at the end of the Alabama game, hit the buzzer beater in the regular season finale at Villanova. So they're going to need somebody to step into that role. Is it Pop Isaacs? I don't know if it will be yet. Maybe it is. Maybe it's another returning guy like Stephen Ashworth. But they needed a big-time bucket getter to play the 2. And I think they got one in Pop Isaacs.
Yeah, I really like Pop Isaacs. I know he can be kind of a polarizing character in college basketball, because he is very heavy volume. He takes a lot of tough shots, and he is a little bit, I don't know what the right word for is on the court, but he's polarizing on the court with his interactions with refs and coaches and players and all of those types of things. He's kind of an outspoken, emotional guy. Yeah. And so I do think he's going to be an interesting fit, but I also think people don't realize he was doing all this and leading a Texas Tech team that, quite honestly, when you look at some of the pieces around him, I don't think was all that good, to a relatively successful season as a freshman. I mean, he still has so much upside left there that it's like, I mean, he can do a lot, I think, and can still get a lot better. So I'm fascinated to see how that works out. But then you add in a Jemiah Neal guy, and he is definitely not Baylor Shireman in terms of his size, his rebounding, his 3-point shooting, certainly not. But he does add something that Baylor didn't give you, and that's another guy who can create, make plays off the dribble, and create his own shot a little bit more. So you're talking about who's going to be like kind of the go-to guy in late moments. Maybe it's a combination of both of these 2 new guys, because they both kind of have that skill set to some extent.
Yeah, no, they absolutely do. I think the day they signed Jemiah, I described him as a high flying, I don't even remember. It was like high flying, hard nosed defender, I think is what it was. And if there are two, kind of adjectives to describe Jemiah Neal, those are probably it. Yeah, exactly right. We saw him do a little bit of everything at Arizona State. If he caught it and was spot up with somebody, he'd walk him down or blow by him or whatever he needed to. Really, the biggest piece that they want to see from his offense is him to continue to get to the rim. Needed a little bit more rim pressure at times last year from somebody other than Ryan Kalkbrenner. And so they're hoping Jemiah can bring that, obviously. But, man, they really, really, really would love to have that defense. You look at the Arizona State tape, and he kind of had that position that Trey Alexander did last year, where it's like, this is the other team's best, 1 through 3. We need you to make them a non-factor. And that's kind of the role he assumed at Arizona State. That's the role that his NIL rep told me, he plans to continue at Creighton. So I didn't, they were going after Roddy Gailey from Ohio State and all of these, kind of high profile transfers, if you will. And I think Jemiah Neal went under the radar a little bit. I think you could say it was a rather unexpected signing compared to, kind of all the noise we heard about Creighton in the portal. But it gives them something that they needed last year that they could certainly benefit from in a Big East that just has, hellacious 3-4s and 2s, obviously.
Yeah, and I think the things we're talking about are the things that he's already proven, right? Like he can, if he gets no better than what he was at Arizona State, he can already do those things for Creighton and add something of value that they really needed and become a major feature in their starting lineup. But I also went into his numbers because I heard something Greg McDermott said in a podcast that he had done at some sports bar. And he said something to the effect of like, when we looked at the shots that Jemiah was taking, those aren't the type of shots he's going to take in our offense, essentially. And obviously we know what Creighton's offense looks like. They're going to put you in position for really clean catch and shoot 3-point looks, right? That's what they do. You look at his numbers, and I think he only shot like low 20s from 3-point range. It was really bad. It's something that you would be like, oh, this guy is not a shooter at all. But when you look at his catch and shoot numbers from 3-point range, they're like 36% or something like that. When it's off the dribble, it's like 17%. So, I mean, there's a huge distinction there between when he was set versus when he was trying to create something off the dribble. And I think in Greg McDermott's system, you know what type of shots you're going to get. So there's a chance that we could even see a better shooting, more efficient Jemiah Neal on the offensive end. And if that's the case, then to your point about some of the more high profile guys in the portal, he might be even more valuable than some of those guys if he actually turns into a better offensive player.
Yeah. And, like I said, kind of the similar thing with Pop is that was the big thing when I talked to Greg McDermott earlier in the summer. They had already, almost finalized the roster. I think they had one scholarship open when we talked. And that was the thing that he was most excited about for Jemiah Neal was the prospect of, we think he took bad shots at Arizona State. Too many contested shots because they ran, this is what his NIL rep was telling me. A lot of times you never really knew when you were going to get the ball next in Arizona State's offense. And so there was always that slight pressure that, man, I've got to put up a shot because I don't know when the next time I'll be able to. That's not going to happen at Creighton. Everybody touches the ball at Creighton. And to your point, you're going to get an open look, if anything, in this offense. I think, Greg McDermott's going to scheme you open for a couple. And yeah, that'll be the thing to watch with Jemiah, because if he can get to, I don't know, let's say if he can shoot 33% this season and apply rim pressure the way that he did at Arizona State, yeah, it could be one of the most underrated transfers in the Big East, probably. Given the fact that we think Creighton's going to be a top 2 team, maybe win the Big East. And so if Jemiah Neal will play a part in that, it is going to play a part in that. He's going to have to take better shots, which you think he will in Omaha, obviously.
Yeah. One other real quick thing I just wanted to note from watching Pop Isaacs, one thing that really stood out to me is he loves throwing the oop. Like, it's like just a second nature thing to him. He'll be like in the middle of crossing a guy over and with one hand he'll flick up an oop out of nowhere. And with Ryan Kalkbrenner on your team, that's a very valuable skill set. I don't know if like Greg McDermott looked at that as part of the reason they really wanted him, because it's like it's a perfect fit with Kalkbrenner.
Right.
But I just want it on the record right now, coming from a guy who covers Xavier, watching those two throw lobs this year is going to be an incredible connection for fans up in Omaha. That's going to be really fun to watch.
Oh, it absolutely is. And Stephen Ashworth, he transferred in from Utah State last year, and he struggled with that a little bit early in the season. He would go for a bounce pass at Ryan Kalkbrenner's knee, or it would be low. 7-footer, you can't put it too low. They got to bend down too far, right? And that was one of the early season struggles they had last year. And then Stephen Ashworth kind of got to the point where he was putting them up there. And so if you're 1 and 2 can both lob it from anywhere on the court to your 7-foot center, the 3-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year, good things are probably going to happen more often than not. That'll be fun to watch.
We're recording this, and just I think yesterday as we're recording this, a little bit of news actually popped up for Creighton, and that is they are adding an international recruit, Fedor Zugic?
Fedor Zugic.
Zugic. Okay, so he's 20 years old, 6'5", 187 pounds, known as a three-point shooter. Looks like there's a little bit more to his game than just spotting up, though, certainly. There's some dunks in there and some baseline rips and drives. But I don't even know exactly what he's going to be in terms of like freshman or transfer, what his eligibility and all that will look like. I'm sure they're sorting it out still. What type of impact do you expect from this guy, though? Because I've seen some like international scouts saying he is going to be a household name in college basketball in a few months.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's almost uncharted waters. I'm sure it's happened somewhere in the country, right? But I can't immediately think of any story where a 20-year-old who will be 21 before the season starts plays 5.5 years professionally and then comes to play college basketball. Almost unheard of, if not unheard of. I would assume Fedor is not coming to Creighton to sit the bench. He was an NBA hopeful. He applied for the draft 2 years ago, withdrew, wants to, from my understanding, work his way back to that point where he can get to the draft and become a legit NBA draft prospect. So it's so interesting because nobody really knows. Does that mean, I know it's only middle of August, but let's spitball a lineup here. Does that mean a guy like Jemiah Neal doesn't play the 3 because Fedor Zugic is going to? Does it mean that Fedor plays the 3 and Jemiah maybe slides to the 4 in some lineups? Can Zugic play the 2? These are all things that I'd imagine Greg McDermott has an answer for, and that we'll soon see the answers to when it comes November.
Yeah, and but that's the tough thing, because with this lineup, let's say he is like clearly a starting level player. Well, you would think so is Stephen Ashworth, Pop Isaacs, and Jemiah Neal. And really none of those guys on a starting lineup do you want sliding down. I mean, Jemiah's the best chance to play the 4, but in a starting lineup, do you really want a 6'5" wing who's a ball handler and playmaker starting at the 4? Are his people going to be okay with that? So it's just interesting to see how they are going to sort these first 3 backcourt positions if Fedor can really make an early impact. You're bringing up the starting lineup. So what would be your projected starting lineup? And we won't hold you to this considering it's the beginning of August. You haven't seen a real practice yet, but what would it be right now as we sit here?
I think the starting lineup as it stands right now would probably be Stephen Ashworth, Pop Isaacs, Jemiah Neal. At the 4, it will be either Mason Miller, the incumbent, obviously, the returning starter, or, we saw flashes in the NCAA tournament, Omaha native Jason Green.
Interesting.
That was one of those redshirt freshmen from last year that kind of needed to prove himself, needed to settle in a little bit more through the first half of the season. And then when they started to deploy him in limited minutes throughout the second half, and especially in the NCAA tournament, he impressed.
Yeah, what's his game like? Because I saw some of him when I was looking back, and I was like, he's the one out of their bench guys that impressed me. Like, he does more for me than Isaac Trout or someone like that. But I'm also like, I don't know exactly what he's like. This big-bodied, sort of rebounder, sort of skilled guy, but I don't know exactly what they're going to ask him to do this year.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing, and that's why I said either Mason Miller or Jason Green. Mason gives you that shooting aspect that Jason cannot, or hasn't yet. Anyways, we saw Jason be pretty hesitant to take a couple of threes last year. Those are the redshirt freshman things that you have to get out of the way. In this offense, especially, if you catch it and you're open, pop it. Nobody. I don't think Greg McDermott's going to yell at anybody for taking a three in this offense. But when it comes to Jason Green, you hit it. You hit it dead on. He can kind of facilitate high IQ player. You see Ryan Kalkbrenner set Creighton's offense a lot of time at the top of the key. Jason Green is capable of that as well. But yeah, really glass crashing, kind of to use the same thing for as I did with Jemiah, hard-nosed rebounder, defender, kind of that like dirty work type of player. That's really what we saw from Jason Green last year. I don't know why that would change. Maybe he adds a couple of things, sure. But I think when Jason Green's on the floor, it's to have a physical mismatch or maybe an equal matchup at the 4 and to get a couple of rebounds, man.
What's your biggest concern about this team? We've talked a lot of positives here. What is the one thing? Because when I look at them, I mean, maybe you could have argued backcourt depth before they added Fedor, but like even now, that's not a huge concern, I wouldn't say. So what's the big thing that stands out to you?
Yeah, it's got to be the lack of depth behind Ryan Kalkbrenner. I don't think it's any secret to anybody who watched Creighton last year that when he was on the floor, Frederick King absolutely struggled. The sequence I always think back to, they were playing Alabama in the non-con, and Ryan Kalkbrenner rolls his ankle, goes to the locker room. The first 2 Alabama plays after that was a back cut and dunk from Grant Nelson, and then a lob from the other side. Immediate timeout from Greg McDermott, pulled Frederick King. And that was kind of when they started the experiment of like, man, when Ryan Kalkbrenner needs a breather, can we play Isaac Trout at the 5 in a small ball lineup? Frederick King entered the transfer portal this year, withdrew. He was a portal dipper. He's back at Creighton. But that's it in terms of depth at the 5. Maybe further along, it's freshman Jackson McAndrew. I think he got to campus, or when he committed, he was like 6'7", 6'8", something like that. And I think he's grown since he got on campus. So maybe in some weird developmental, experimental small lineup, it's Jackson McAndrew running the 5. But that's probably the biggest concern for me is you don't want Ryan Kalk. He can do it. He did it all of last year, but you don't want Ryan Kalkbrenner to have to play 38 minutes a night. So that's the biggest thing for me is what do you do when the big man needs a breather?
All right, we'll wrap this up kind of where we started. I know we've kind of already given our thoughts. Both of us think this Creighton team could contend for the Big East title this year in the regular season. Official pick here as we sit in August. Are you going to go second?
Yeah, I think so. I'm a firm believer that you are if you've won the league, like UConn has the past 2 years, and you've won back-to-back national championships, I'm a firm believer that you're at the top until you're not.
Agreed.
Until somebody kind of takes you out of there. But yeah, I think Creighton's gonna finish second in the league. Marquette might be a sleeper. Xavier's gonna be up there. But I think I'll go with Creighton to finish second, UConn first, and that's where I'll land.
Yeah, I kind of have those two teams up in their own tier. I think after them, then you kind of got like Xavier, St. John's, that next tier. You could maybe throw Marquette, maybe throw Providence, whoever you want in that next tier. But like for me, it's those two teams are kind of at the top by themselves with a little bit of gap between 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6. So Jon, awesome stuff. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. You can find his work at omaha.com for the Omaha World Leader. And your Twitter handle is by Jon Walker. That's Jon, Jon. So, Jon, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate this.
Hey, thanks, Rick.
All right. Really appreciate Jon joining us to talk some Creighton Blue Jays basketball here in the summer. I know he's busy. He works at a newspaper. There's all types of things going on to the start of sports season in the fall right now, and they're always stretched thin. So appreciate him joining us. Appreciate you guys checking in and listening to this podcast. If you are not a subscriber to musketeerreport.com, you got to sign up. It's where all the best Xavier fans online are talking Xavier hoops 24/7. Year-round. I know you're feeling like, oh, there's nothing going on right now. It's August. It's not basketball season. I miss hoop season. Come over to musketeerreport.com. It's basketball season all the time. So join us there. We'll talk to you on the message board, or I'll talk to you on the next podcast.